let's go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and welcome to the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy here at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design. I'm Paul Bonney, and I'm former vice president at Exelon. I've also been a board member here and fortunate to be that since the beginning of the Energy Policy Center, so for the last 10 years. And it's a privilege to be here with you today. Today, we're talking about the Distributed Capacity Procurement model, a new tool for utilities, and what it is, how it works, and how it's going to help utilities meet power demand needs. I'm sharing the stage here with Pier LaFarge, who's the co-founder and CEO of a company called Sparkfund. Sparkfund does deployment services, helping utilities grow the grid by deploying DERs at scale. Pierre's a trustee of the Nature Conservancy's Maryland and DC chapter, and as a next-gen strategy committee member, supports the board of Fidelity Charitable. Previously, he'd been at ICF International, where he co-founded a service offering focused on energy efficiency financing strategy. In 2010, he founded Race to Replace, a statewide clean energy voter registration campaign in Vermont in partnership with the League of Conservation Voters. Welcome, Pierre. We're going to have a conversation together for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions. You see cards on your seats. If you have a question, you can write it down, or we'll have a microphone that'll be available if you want to ask questions. So either way. Before we get into a discussion of DCP, I wanted to pause for a personal question. As you know, Pierre, Ben Franklin helped founded the University of Pennsylvania and in the 1700s and proved that lightning is a form of electricity. I understand you have a personal connection.
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Great to be here. What a beautiful building. It's about as grand and campusy as the university gets. So it's a real honor to be here. Thanks for having me for the conversation. Yes, that is true. I don't often talk about this professionally, but here we are in the place itself. I'm one of 1,500 or so direct descendants of Benjamin Franklin. I guess great-great-grandmother, Margaret Mason Herrick, who was his great-great-grandmother.
Okay. Before we get into what the DCP model is and how it works, I wanted to start with a little bit of background and talk about what the issues are and challenges are that you're trying to address through the model. So maybe I can just ask you to explore a little bit, what are some of those macro challenges that we're seeing in the industry?
Yeah, so we wanted to start just sort of grounding folks in this conversation because, look, one of the most exciting things about energy in this moment is energy and the energy economy has probably changed more in the last 24 months than it has in the last 30 years, right? Load growth really is the dominant signal there. Data centers, manufacturing, EVs, home electrification. When you add all of that up, you have a fundamental shift in a return to load growth. And in a lot of ways, the electric grid, the energy economy, as it pertains to electric power, is really downstream of that signal. So just want to take a minute and talk about that. So, there is this huge challenge coming. I often say that if the United States is going to double its electric grid, right, or maybe it grows by 50%, maybe it's 100%, right? There are different forecasts, but it's going to grow a heck of a lot. And doubling the US electric grid is like the economic scale of the highway system and the technical complexity of the space race, right? This is an enormous societal scale challenge that's going to take a huge amount of technology, of new business models, of capital, of companies, and most of all, the utility system that we've invented and run for 120 years to deliver electric power to every building in the country is going to have to rapidly build out this landscape scale machine to move twice as much power across it and also have a lot more of that power be intermittent, right? Because renewable energy is actually cheap to generate. It's not necessarily cheap to deliver if you have to have a grid that handles the intermittency. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today with distributed capacity and the role of batteries is going to be about that. One quick point, just to make sure we're all clear what we're talking about, right? The first rule of energy, I'm sure everyone here at the Kleinman Center knows, is have as many acronyms as possible. That's why it's the DCP, right? It's a great contribution of a career just to add one more acronym to the pile. That's why we're all here. But distributed energy resources, really very simply batteries, right? So just like what's in your phone, you can charge them. You charge them up from the grid and they dispatch energy. They are not power plants. You don't get new power from them. They just can be charged up and dispatched. Backup generators, you get new power from those because you're using fossil fuels, diesel or gas to do it. And that's just like a dinosaur battery. Just have to wait a while. And then solar panels as well. So really, when we talk about DERs for today's purposes, we're going to talk about solar, batteries, and gensets. There are a whole lot of other ones, connected thermostats, distributed water heaters, even vehicles can be DERs. So we'll talk more about the installed assets of solar, batteries, and gensets.
And so how do DERs fit into solving the challenge that you were talking about in terms of demand growth?
Yeah, so what's interesting is the US electric grid was started with the premise that you generate power in a central place, like a coal or a gas plant, and you'd build a bunch of wires across the whole landscape to push that power out to every building. And the centralized nature of the grid works really well if you have a long time to kind of build new power plants and then slowly upgrade the grid to meet demand. But when the grid starts to grow really quickly, and particularly when new sources of energy are not baseload on all the time, like a gas plant is on all the time, wind and solar are only on when it's sunny or windy. And so that grid has to grow in a way that is able to handle that intermittency. And so DERs really come down to the concept of flexibility, demand flexibility. And as you push energy across the grid, the distributed energy resources can help that grid adapt either by absorbing excess energy, by charging the batteries, or by backfilling energy from solar and gensets when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And sometimes people talk about the need to build a smart grid. Well, a lot of the concept of the distributed capacity procurement is that by putting batteries everywhere on a grid that needs to grow fast and handle intermittency, you can handle the same infrastructure need by building a sort of smart sponge. And smart sponges are cheaper and easier to build than re-architecting the grid to handle the same issue.
And so we note on the slide here some numbers about DERs as a percentage of the solution. Can you comment further on that? And what else do we need to build out to meet that demand?
Yeah, for a long time, DERs were seen as a sort of thing that would happen at the edge of the grid, right? Some homeowners would buy solar panels, some buildings would put, batteries in their basements, but it was never seen as a core part of the grid. It was always going to be a few percentage points, and it was mostly about a given building owner, their choice to have backup power or to generate their own electricity. What's shifted now that the grid has to grow is that a lot of grid planners now believe that the best way to double their grid would be to make distributed energy 10 or 20% of the whole grid, which is just a huge shift in the context of what DERs are or could be. The US electric grid has a nameplate generating capacity of about 1,200 gigawatts of installed generation. If it doubles, there's 2,400 or so. So if you had 20% of that grid being distributed energy resources, you're talking about hundreds of gigawatts, right? 300, 500, 600 gigawatts of solar panels, batteries, and generators spread all across a city or a landscape. And that is just a completely different level of deployment that I think people had previously envisioned.
So you mentioned that people can today voluntarily, through competitive markets, install distributed energy resources and are doing that. And we see the growth of virtual power plants. Can you explain what the DCP model is and what it contributes to the deployment of distributed energy resources and the solution to this issue that we've identified?
Yeah. So one of the challenges that distributed energy has always had is that when you have to sell it one building at a time, right? And you have to go to a customer and say, hey, you're a school, your job is to teach students. You're a hospital, your job is to take care of patients, whatever it is. The people who live in those buildings wake up every day and want to focus on their core mission, their core business, right? What they do best. And the task of convincing them to spend a bunch of money, not on textbooks or new classrooms or on MRI machines, but on solar panels or batteries when they already have the grid, is hard and it's slow. And so the biggest point of friction inside deploying this stuff before the grid was growing and before the distributed capacity procurement was that it took a really long time to convince a given customer to add that equipment to their building. And then when they did, they would often only add enough equipment for a part of their own energy use. They wouldn't oversize the system to be pushing back in a major way so that it could support all the buildings around it, right? And so in that context, the DCP says, okay, well, what if the people who built the grid, the utilities, just bought distributed energy resources at scale? What if they put them into the planning of how they're going to grow the grid and then actually knock on the door of a building, a university, a hospital, and say, you focus on teaching students, you focus on taking care of patients, we're your utility, we're going to, with your permission, build as much solar and batteries and generating capacity here as we can possibly fit for the benefit of your building, for your neighbors, for the city, and ultimately for the growth of the grid. And the utilities, under the distributed capacity procurement model, actually pay that building owner to host that asset. So all of a sudden, that university, instead of having to take money away from its budget to teach students or build out classrooms, actually gets more money to support their core mission, creating more of a virtual cycle of a utility being a utility and a university being a university.
Can you describe more how that process would fit with grid planning, capital planning on the, classically on the utility side?
Right. Well, utilities are used to thinking in big centralized chunks, right? One gas plant, one grid. So to be clear, this is sort of like teaching an old dog new tricks, which is hard. But the good news is that over the last 20 years, there is a flourishing ecosystem of distributed energy resource companies. There's technology that is low cost, that works, and there's a lot of planning software. So as utilities look out onto this totally unprecedented amount of load growth that's coming, again, data centers turning back on for generative AI, manufacturing coming back to the United States, electric vehicles plugging into the grid, heat pumps, home electrification. When you add that all up, right, to be clear, the doubling of the US electric grid is not the high end, this might happen forecast. It's actually the haircut forecast. If you took all the data center load alone inside the queues of American electric utilities, you'd need to something like 5x the grid. So when we say it's going to double the grid, we're actually assuming that a lot of that demand doesn't show up. And I think that's an important point when you think about planning, because one of the superpowers of an American electric utility is long-term thinking. They're one of the few institutions in our society that really is chartered to think on 5, 10, and 20-year cycles. They're not perfect, but they are good at long-term thinking. And so in that context, they've got to pick up new tools like new software. They've got to analyze their grid at the level of buildings and the wires that connect to them. And they've got to determine in new ways, how would putting batteries all over Philadelphia actually improve the grid and also let them spend less on upgrading the traditional grid, like upsizing a substation or something like that.
Can you elaborate on that last point and sort of the optimization of the grid and the deployment of DERs versus other models which say, let this happen, let the market develop it,
Sure.
let people voluntarily do it, having the utility at the center of it? How is that different?
Yeah, markets are great at a lot of things, but they're not great at planning a very centralized system. So when you think about the grid, every time you attach a new battery or a new solar panel to it, it changes the whole grid. The grid is actually a physical balance of electricity flowing across a whole landscape. I find it helpful sometimes to think of the electricity actually as like water, right? It's literally sloshing around in the grid. Electricity is like a physical substance. It has inertia, it has weight. And so when you add new stuff in random places to a system that has to be in balance, it makes it harder to balance and it makes it more expensive to balance, because what utilities have to do in response to new stuff coming on their grid that they can't see coming is they have to upgrade equipment in places they might not have needed to spend that money to begin with. So when you have a grid that you're planning and managing, its job is to keep the lights on 24/7, darn near 100% of the time at the lowest cost. It's hard when you can't see things coming. And so this puts the kind of act of those small fragmented pieces of machinery into the planning process to begin with. And that lets the utility say, look, over here, I have a pocket of my grid that hasn't been invested in for a while, that has old substations, aging transformers. I would either need to spend a bunch of money making that grid more modern, or I could achieve the same result of balancing my grid by putting batteries all over that neighborhood. And that choice, that optionality, being able to think at system scale is really helpful, particularly when a delicate system starts to change really quickly.
Can you explain more about how you envision the hosting arrangement that you discussed working, and who does the operation and maintenance of the facilities, and are there contracts that embody that relationship? How do you think that would work?
Yeah, so if you've been to a city recently and you look carefully, and if you're an infrastructure nerd, which I assume by default, if you showed up here today, you're at least got to be at least halfway there. Otherwise, you're just lost. But just wandered into the Kleinman Center. So if you look at cities, you can see on the sides of buildings 5G infrastructure, right? So telecom companies have been doing this for 20 years now, paying building owners to host the smaller versions of a big cell tower, right? So if you're out in a big rural area, you can put the stuff up on a pole and it can blast for miles. But if you're in a city, there are lots of tight corners and buildings that block the signal. So you need to put lots of small distributed telecom infrastructure all over a city to create that mesh network that we all enjoy with our cell phones. And so this concept of infrastructure hosting is actually a well-proven model, both in cities and outside of them, right? In energy, you've had infrastructure hosting like putting wind farms in farmers' fields, gas wells on Appalachian hillsides. So paying people who own property or buildings to be part of a public infrastructure system is a pretty straightforward model. And what's great about it is it lets the person who owns the building, in this case, host a battery for the benefit, again, of their building, their neighbors, the grid itself, and they get a check every month from the utility. There's no debt. They don't have to sign up for a lease or a loan, and there's no maintenance liability. They don't have to worry about that asset. It's the utility's job to maintain it. And ultimately, that gives them a annuity that, again, lets them invest in whatever they want to in their lives or in their businesses or institutions, while providing the physical space to make the grid work better. Just like a building that has a 5G infrastructure on it makes cell phones available for everyone.
And are you envisioning that this would this hosting arrangement would be mostly on commercial and industrial type sites, or would it extend to residential as well?
Yeah, I think it would certainly extend to both. Sparkfund's focus is on commercial, industrial, municipal, universities, schools, hospitals. We do the sort of medium and larger DERs because the grid is growing so fast that installing this stuff in bigger chunks gets more capacity out there more quickly. So I think that the distributed capacity procurement is starting all around the country in that C&I context, but residential provides a huge opportunity to aggregate lots of little small things. And if you do enough little small things, you get a big thing. So residential batteries, solar panels, hot water heaters, controllable thermostats, right? If you have a Nest or an Ecobee, those will become an extension of the grid, helping the grid turn up and down energy demand as it needs to balance the production of energy and the consumption of energy.
And do you envision that the facilities would be front of meter, behind the meter, or does it matter to the deployment and model and operation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so there are two really distinct ways of talking about behind the meter and front of the meter, BTM and FTM, for those who are have their acronym flickers out. Yeah, right. Hopefully someone's keeping score. So the most important way to think about it is contractually. So if it's behind the meter, if you have a solar panel that's producing energy, then you should get paid for some portion of that production, right? It should impact your bill. That's your energy. It's behind your contractual meter. You own it, so you should get paid for it. These assets will be front of the meter in that contractual sense, in that they'll be on your house or building, but you won't necessarily see any change to your bill if the solar panel or the battery produces more or less energy. What you'll get is a line item on your bill every month that pays you for having the asset. But what's cool about that is, think about small business, I call this the T to T rule, taco shops to targets. So thinking on the lower end of that spectrum, if you have a retail storefront in a city and they might pay $400 to $500 a month in commercial energy use, right? Not a very big store. But have you ever been behind a commercial area and you see like a bunch of cracked pavement and a fence, sort of like they maybe got a dumpster back there. There's always like a little bit of space. And a 4 megawatt hour battery, which is a really big battery, only takes up 3 parking spaces. It's like 1 shipping container. So if you dropped a shipping container behind every taco shop or retail front in a city, that small business owner who's paying $400 or $500 a month in energy costs might get $8,000 to $15,000 a month in hosting. So you're talking about an order of magnitude more than they're paying in energy. So you're paying $500 for energy, and the hosting line item might be 15 grand. That's enough money to change that small business's cash flow, to hire more employees, to and save up to buy their building from their landlord, right? We're talking about real infrastructure money. And that makes sense because the grid is a multi-$100 billion machine that sits as the foundation of our whole society. If the lights aren't on, you don't get tacos and you don't get Targets. And so fundamentally, the idea of participating in the wealth and the, again, from an energy justice standpoint, of having a vehicle to bring parts of that shared infrastructure value that drives the economy to small businesses, to homeowners, is really critical. And I'll say one more thing on the energy justice piece. If you make a map of the grid and say, where has it been underinvested in over the last 20 or 30 years? Well, the grid mostly follows where they're building new buildings, right? Just by default. Where are you building new buildings? In richer neighborhoods or bigger commercial zones. Where you're not building new buildings are historically disadvantaged parts of the city. So the place that the utility will host these assets first, the place that the grid is the oldest and needs the most help, is actually the inverse map of economic development in the city, and hosting assets in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So there's also a really interesting kind of energy justice piece of this, particularly because each of those business owners or homeowners in parts of the grid that need it most have not necessarily, they don't have to sign a loan, they don't need to have a credit score check, right? They can participate in that annuity, in that monthly check, with no risk or no debt, which I think is a really critical aspect of justice. Don't transfer value from participation in a system if it also requires liability or risk, if you can help it.
From the operations side, can you explain what might be required from the utility? Maybe just defining what a DERMS is, and is that going to be necessary for the operation of all this distributed storage?
Yeah, so the framework, if you think about, okay, grid's going to double, 20% of that could be served from machines all over a landscape, right? Distributed energy. To make the grid 20% distributed, a utility would need basically 3 capability layers. You need a planning layer to plan where you put them, how much, of what type, right? Batteries, gensets, solar, right? What's the best type of equipment? So once you've planned how much, where, and of what type, then you need a deployment layer, right? You need to go talk to potential hosts, folks who own buildings, and say, can we put this here? You need to coordinate a local ecosystem of vendors to go design and build it, because utilities aren't going to go build this themselves. They don't even build the power plants. They don't build the grid. They just coordinate it and capitalize it. So they're going to build a local, flourishing ecosystem of distributed energy companies that bid into tranches, that design and build and deliver this type of asset. And then you have to do all the compliance and verification to make sure the assets are maintained and that they're on and delivering value. So that's the deployment layer. That's really where Sparkfund plays, right? Our business is designed to be the deployment services layer of the grid. And then the last layer is dispatch. So planning, deployment, and dispatch. Dispatch just means turning them on and off at the right times when the grid needs energy or needs to shed some load. And those are the DERMS companies, right? Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems, another quick acronym. Management systems basically are software that can connect to a battery or a genset and turn it on when the grid needs it. So planning, deployment, and dispatch, I think, are the three key layers.
How will the costs of this kind of DER system, DERMS, et cetera, included, be recovered? How will the utility get paid for this?
Yeah, so just like any other part of the grid, utilities are chartered by our society, right? They are a public purpose entity, even though they're a private company. the reason they're granted monopolies is that they are required to keep the lights on 100% of the time, connect every building in a state to that grid, whether it's a far off cabin in the woods somewhere or right downtown. And so in return for that monopoly charter, they are regulated by the state in public purpose. And so ultimately, a utility has this obligation to meet whatever the load growth is in a state. And so if Pennsylvania ends up with a bunch of data centers and manufacturing coming back, if the governor and the people of Pennsylvania want more manufacturing jobs, want more data centers, want more EVs, then the utility is chartered to support that growth. And the regulator, their job is to say, well, what is the cheapest, fastest, best way to meet the things the state wants to have be true about the buildings in the state? And my premise is that the cheapest, fastest way to meet 20% of it, just one piece of the problem, but a chunk of the problem is distributed energy. So if a regulator agrees that DERs can and should be the cheapest, fastest way to get 20% of that problem solved, then they just make it like any other piece of grid equipment. The utility pays for it, they put it into their rate base, they earn a regulated return on it, and then they include it in rates to everyone as part of their charter to meet the needs of Pennsylvania.
And you touched on the process of getting that rate recovery. Part of that, as you all probably know, is demonstrating prudence of that investment.
Yep.
And that usually is an examination of alternatives. Have you looked at that question of whether, in fact, this model of procurement of these assets on a distributed basis is cheaper than some of the traditional central generation alternatives?
Yeah, we have, and it depends in every state. It's a little different, right? So there'll be some places that maybe only need 5% of their grid to be distributed. Some would be 40, right? I mean, 20 is sort of a rough sense of what this could be. But the way to determine whether it's 5 or 40 is to go and actually really look at the budgeted infrastructure of a utility and say, how many substations, how many transformers, how many of the wires that connect to these buildings need to be upgraded, and how soon? How old are they? And if you needed to double the grid, if you needed to double the amount of electricity coursing through those, how many of those things would melt if you did that, right? And if you think about it, if you have a transformer and your one choice is to spend $100 upgrading it so it doesn't melt, or you can spend $50 putting a battery so that it catches that electricity when it's at its highest so the thing doesn't melt, the cheapest way to do that is build the battery for $50 rather than upgrade it for $100. And so that sort of simple budget level blocking and tackling takes a long time. There's a whole cost benefit analysis framework in a lot of states, as you're well aware. And so when you do that math, you then determine, okay, to double the grid or handle whatever amount of growth that grid has, is it 300 megawatts of batteries? Is it a gigawatt hour? Like, what's the sort of right amount? But you're really going bottom up and determining where on the grid, down to the feeder level, using something called power flow analysis, it would be cheaper to put a battery instead of upgrade the physical copper and wires of the grid. So that's the kind of foundation of that analysis. There are a lot of other steps, like when you put in batteries, you can handle congestion and inertial balancing better. You have a better chance of interconnecting large load customers. So there's some other value stack. There's some other reasons that you can create value by putting DERs out there, but at its core, it's, do I buy a $50 battery or a $100 piece of copper to make the grid not melt?
I had the pleasure in my career of having to defend judgments about investments in the utility system, some of those being major investments like Limerick Nuclear Plant, major transmission lines, smart meter systems, et cetera. One of the benefits that I see from this model is the incremental nature. It strikes me that it's more like deployment of demand response or some other things. And so you're not asking the regulator, you're not asking customers to bite off a big investment with the hope that it comes to fruition and it's cost effective. Can you comment on that, the sort of the more incremental nature of this approach?
Yeah, it's particularly important when the load growth forecasts are so variable, right? I mean, everyone agrees that there's a lot of increase in the demand for electric power, but you could argue in any state, whether that's 4% a year, 5% or 7%, but because of the law of compounding growth, it matters a ton whether it's 4 or 7, right? Those are two really different growth curves. And if you're not sure which it is and you have to make a bet that's going to be with you for 20 or 40 years, let alone the climate implications of the infrastructure you're putting in, having an ability to deploy a battery or a solar system, you can build these things in 9 months, right? In a lot of cases, 6 to 9 month construction cycles, less for that for residential. And so it almost creates like a variable speed drive. You don't have to build this big blocky staircase and be right. Like you have to guess what 20 years out is going to look like, and you have to lay the tracks for 20 years of uncertainty. If you start building lots of small things, well, if you're wrong, if the load growth isn't showing up, then you can stop in a given month and not build for a while until the load growth shows back up. So it gives you a little bit more control over how you grow your grid compared to the long arc of a nuclear plant.
Is this distributed capacity procurement model in the idea stage, or are people really exploring it or deploying it?
Yeah, it's been amazing how quickly it's gone from sort of concept to reality. We've been working on this concept of utility-led DER deployment for several years, but really in the last 10 months, we've seen several of the largest utilities in the country wake up to this new reality of load growth. And again, load growth, we keep using that term, right? But it just means that people are building new buildings, and when they show up and say, I have a manufacturing plant, well, 80 years ago, when you built a manufacturer, you would put a coal plant next to that manufacturing facility, right? You would have a thermal on-site generator that was dirty and smoky and inefficient, but it was a good, simple way to forge steel or make cars. Well, now, when you build a factory, you use cleaner electric power. And that's a technology change, it's an economic change, it's good news for the environment, but all of a sudden, that manufacturing site that might have only used a little bit from the grid for its exterior lighting and served all of its own load with a freaking tiny coal plant needs everything from the grid. So the grid has to just generate a huge amount more for that manufacturing plant to exist. Same with a data center, right? These are just warehouses filled with electric machines. And so load growth fundamentally is served best by just by like that sort of planning, I guess.
Let me ask a two-part final question before we turn it over to other questions you might have from the audience. Does this model work equally well in retail markets that have been deregulated and then have choice? And what kind of regulatory and legislative changes might be necessary in various states to enable this kind of model?
Yeah, no, and to go back to your last question, right, tie the bridges between the two, I got distracted by the coal plants, which is amazing. Right? They used to build tiny coal plants. It just blows my mind.
Universities.
I get distracted by that fact, right? It's like you see these buildings, it's like, it's a tiny coal plant. I didn't know that before, like 10 years ago. That's a shocking fact to me. And so the places this is starting to happen, right, are the places where they're seeing the most load growth from manufacturing and data centers. So think Georgia, Minnesota, Wisconsin, East Coast, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. So we've seen a couple of really big utilities actually go to their regulator and say outright, we think that a big chunk of our grid can be distributed, which is great, right? Because a lot of the distributed energy, the point of distributed energy is often to fight climate change, to build more renewable energy, right? Utilities, when the grid wasn't growing, didn't want DERs on their grid because they couldn't see it coming. So it's exciting to see utilities show up at commissions and say, for the first time in 30 years, we want more of this. We want it to be a proactive part of our planning. So Excel in Minnesota filed for 400 megawatts to a gigawatt of nameplate distributed energy last August, on August 9th. That was included in their settlement of their integrated resource plan, IRP, click, and approved in December. So that's the largest single procurement of distributed energy resources in history. There's never been a gigawatt of DERs planned at one time anywhere in the United States or in the world. So that's really historic. And Exelon, your former employer, with the joint utilities in Maryland, so think Baltimore Gas and Electric, PECO and PEPCO, came to their commission and said, the way we're going to meet our demand flexibility mandate, there's a law in Maryland that says they've got to put a bunch of batteries out there. And so the way they're going to do that is a distributed capacity procurement. And we're working now with 11 other major utilities all across the country to bring this concept to their regulator and really make distributed energy resources a kind of critical part of the next phase of the grid's growth.
With that, I think we'll take questions. As I said, if anybody wants to write it down on a card, otherwise we can pass the microphone around. Yes, why don't we go ahead? Yeah, we'll get a microphone here.
We'll get you a microphone in a second. Get a team of runners.
Here, do you want to identify who?
Thank you. First of all,
Let me say who you are too.
Louis Padullo, I'm an adjunct professor here.
Great.
I teach product design, how you come up with new products.
Great.
You've got room on that drawing for the windmill, which I assume you approve of because it'll keep the birds from pooping on the panels.
Yes,
Right?
it's a
'Cause
critical.
They scare birds.
It's
Right?
a critical function. Yeah,
But what I was curious about is
anti-pooping.
the the importance of batteries in your scheme. For example, could you put that shipping container with batteries at substations? Could every substation be a place where you can put those big chunks of batteries? And also, when I first worked on this, we did it with Pico. We had to get permission to sell back into the grid. We were doing solar panel. We were doing roof tiles that were solar panels. And then the point was you needed permission to sell it back into the grid very cheaply, by the way.
Right.
The grid decided what they'd pay for it, but you got something for it.
Right.
But why not just dump it back into the grid and store it in the centralized battery places as opposed to having to have batteries everywhere?
Those are two great questions, and really three. So first of all, yes, wind turbines should be on that graph. I actually just became advisor of a really cool distributed building sited wind company called Accelerate Wind that has horizontal, I call them horizontal spinny things. And so they put them up at the edges of buildings and take advantage of the updraft of wind. And it's great because you can generate electricity at night when solar panels do the day. So yeah, that's very, very true. The second part of your question, the grid works as a battery in terms of balancing, but you wouldn't want to send electricity from a building all the way to a central storage area because you would get transmission losses twice. And you don't want that it decreases what's called round trip efficiency, which is both the act of putting it into a battery, you get less out than you put in. And then also the further away the battery is from your generation, the less efficient that is. So putting small or medium format batteries near smaller medium format generation is the best coupled system for total generative efficiency. And then your substation question, the answer is absolutely. And a lot of utilities are putting batteries at their substations. That is actually part of our business. Problem is substations, particularly in the places the grid is most dense, are tiny, right? There is no extra space. If you go to a substation here in Philadelphia, there's like 2 inches on either side of it that is not filled with all the equipment they can possibly put there to make the grid not melt while serving a city of this size. Cities have grown up around the grid and they've gotten more dense. And so it would be great if there was enough space because it would be the most efficient to put a battery right at a substation. So that should be done first and everywhere you can. So your question is, I think, a really good one. The problem is you just run out of space really quickly.
I got a question in writing that follows up on something I said. What regulatory or legislative changes would you like to see that would enable or encourage this kind of model to allow the build out?
Yeah, so what's so fun about the distributed capacity procurement is that the answer to your question is nothing. It requires no regulatory or legislative change. And every other idea for 40 years about how to get DERs out there fast has required a tectonic societal battle of regulatory and legislative change. And I think something I probably should have said earlier is the idea that I just went through with you is like the least innovative idea ever. All I just said was utilities should be utilities. They should plan how much they need, where they need it, of what. And if the grid needs it and a regulator agrees that that's in the public interest to meet the needs of a state, they should put it in those places. That's it. So the regulatory system of a US electric utility, despite all of its flaws, despite all of the decades of conflict about adopting climate technology, right? Because the charter of a US utility is low cost, most reliable to support economic development. We did not put climate change in that charter. Maybe we should have, but we didn't. And so despite those decades of frustration with utilities, mostly around adopting climate-related technologies, the system works pretty well at supporting economic development. And now data centers, manufacturing, and EVs are exactly the type of normal economic development that the US electric utility was built to serve. So the system works pretty well in these conditions. Saw a couple of questions. Saw a young fellow back there.
Thanks for telling us about DCP today. It sounds like a great solution. My name is Lorenzo Galang. I'm a junior studying chemical engineering and biophysics. And I was wondering if you could talk more about how long you project the contract lengths between small businesses and the utility company, for example, are going to last, and how you're going to handle the situation where, let's say, your taco shop's lease runs out and they don't want to take the battery with them, but the next customer doesn't want the battery either. So who gets the battery and what happens in that situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the leases are typically asset lifetime, so anywhere from 10 to 20 years, depending on the asset. So batteries, 7 to 15 years, solar panels up to 25 years. So yeah, think 15 years on average. And there would be a clause, and there is a clause in the contract that says the owner of the building can sell the building or lease the building, and it requires a simple transfer to the next tenant. So there could be a situation where that next tenant says, I want to take this building over, but not have this asset here. And then what would be required is for that tenant, they would have the option to tell the utility, get your equipment off my lawn, so to speak. But they would have to buy the equipment from the utility. So there is some friction there. When you host assets, just like 5G, like if you want to renovate the exterior of your building and kick the 5G off, you have to pay Verizon for the equipment you're about to break. So again, a pretty well-established concept inside this contract law and those interactions, but that's why some building owners, if they were just about to renovate their building or do a big, change in the footprint of their building, might say no to an asset. The first big deployment of these we did was in San Diego Gas and Electric territory. We did about 1,447 of these installations, and we had a 94% acceptance rate from cold lead. So from first phone call to, yes, you can put this here for money, it was 94% of people, but 6% said no for a range of reasons. And it's important because no utility program or no clean energy deployment program in history has gotten much above a 35% acceptance rate. So when I said it's slow and variable to get this stuff out there, right? My business has spent 11 years selling DERs. I maybe should have said that. Sparkfund has done $500 million of DER installations, 4,000 projects in 40 states, right, with 12 utilities, the slow and hard way. So we built this idea out of how hard it was, even though I'm proud of what we've done and we got pretty good at it. It is hard and slow to knock on a university door and say, hey, instead of, all this stuff, do you want to build $10 million worth of batteries? Over there.
Hi, Thomas Crookham. I'm on the Lower Merion Township Environmental Advisory.
Great. Thank you.
First-
Thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I've been screaming into the void for years now that if we could align incentives for these type of resources with the utilities, that we could push forward. So I'm glad, I guess the void answered in the form of your plan. So thank you. My question is, we're a small municipality in the scheme of things. What can I have the potential to influence the Board of Commissioners to support this sort of legislation, or potentially attract PECO or some other utility to the township to invest in this sort of resource, the DER resource? What can we do, or is there any models for any townships or towns or municipalities that I can look to?
Yeah, well, look, PECO and Exelon in general is really coming out as a real leader on this, so they're going to be bringing it to the commission. I think it's critical for civic leaders to show up in the commission and say, look, we should stop arguing about whether we can finance or do this on different types of ownership models. Like, what we want for the climate, what we want for our communities, what we want for our economy is for a bunch of this distributed energy to be out there in the world. And so I think letting the commission, who has been deep inside that 20 years of fierce antagonistic debate, just take a breath and recognize that the thing that's changed is the grid's growing again. And in that world, now that solar panels and batteries and gensets are actually cheap and they actually work, right? The DER industry has done its job. We've created solutions that can scale. Now's the time to take a breath and put them inside the core of the system, and they will go to scale. But voices like yours can be hugely helpful to the commission, who hears too much just from a utility person and a solar advocate who dislikes the utility with the full fiber of their being. There is a lot of bad blood between the DER industry and utilities, and that is understandable with 20 years of the DER industry saying, buy my thing, and utility saying, no. And they say, but it's good for the climate. The utility says, that is not part of my charter. I work for society, lowest cost, most reliable. Without load growth, a solar panel and a battery are not lowest cost, most reliable, right? They are not cheaper than gas plants and wind farms. Building big generation and big transmission is cheaper and more reliable until the grid grows so fast and has enough intermittency that you need the DERs to be faster and able at handling that intermittency. So it's the world that's changed around it, while DERs have gotten cheap enough and safe enough to get out there.
Let me ask you to elaborate a little bit on that point, because that's maybe the main rub, right? This disconnect between the competitive market wanting to build and sell and the utilities, right? And so how does this model address that and solve it? And what's been your experience on that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, look, what's fun is this idea is starting to get people to put down their arms, right, and take a breath, which has been a really fun experience in the States where we've been doing this. And if you are a DER company, even if you spent 20 years being grumpy at utilities, if you design, build, install, and maintain, right? If you hire crews, if you do good union labor, if you do a good job on the site putting that battery in, this is a great thing for you, because the worst thing about the business of being in selling DERs is the selling part, having to go out and have those low conversion rates and long sales cycles. The best thing about being in the DER business is when you get to build the thing and you do it well, you do good for the world, you do good for the climate, and you make money doing it. And so this makes the utility your largest, most predictable wholesale customer ever. The utility is going to buy hundreds of megawatts of this stuff. And those people are going to be able to grow their businesses faster, more predictably. They'll plan labor, they'll hire better, they'll have bigger warehouses, they'll be able to invest in warehouse software. A lot of DER companies, including some of my own subdivisions, have a couple of guys packing trucks at every order because the orders are spaced a couple months apart. So you can't have people standing there every hour with a piece of software telling them how to pack the next truck if you're waiting 6 months between deployments. So predictable, scaled value chains are what create efficiency, they're what lower cost, and they're great for the DER industry. There is one part of the DER industry that loses in this, and it is the part of the solar industry particularly that is a financing part, right? If your business is primarily getting customers to agree to financing agreements, to take out leases and loans, right? High cost debt, to have those pieces of equipment on their property, the utility has a low-cost, regulated return cost of capital, and they're going to outcompete you. So the people who are against this is essentially infrastructure investors who want a 12% return when the utility gets a lower one.
Let me add too, if I might, just to your specific question. Montgomery County in Maryland is very forward when it comes to advocacy and installation of new technology, including DERs. As Pierre mentioned, Maryland has set a very aggressive target. They just passed another statute this week. So there's going to be significant utility deployment of DERs there, including in Montgomery County. But that's a place I would suggest that you look for guidance. Yeah.
Okay.
Finley Shapiro, I'm an electrical engineering consultant, mainly PV and batteries, and beginning to dabble in data centers. Could you comment on the PJM capacity market and how this might fit into the issues that are going on with that market now?
Yeah. Well, gosh, PJM is running out of capacity because it's hard and slow to build big centralized things. And it turns out when you rely only on market signals to give 20-year stability to make infrastructure investments, a lot of investors say, well, what if the market changes? So what would you do? You would create a central planning socialized system with a regulated public purpose mandate and say, think 20 years ahead, and you'd call that a utility. So two things. One, I'll answer your question directly, but before I do, I'll give one of my favorite spicy hot takes, which is that by 2050, every part of the United States will again be a vertically integrated, fully regulated power market with central planning. Because planning over those long time horizons, in PJM, you're seeing a sort of market failure twice. The capacity auction in the last 2 turns, as I'm sure you know, has hit its mandated cap, right? Capacity in PJM is now more expensive than it's ever been. That cost is flowing through to increased power prices for hundreds of millions of Americans. And yet when you ask an infrastructure investor, prices are high, time to build, right? Like, well, look, a gas plant's a 20-year asset. I don't know if these prices are going to continue for 20 years. So market price signals are actually a pretty bad way to know whether or not you should build the next incremental 20 or 30-year bet with your capital. It's why we invented central planning for utilities in the first place, where you take a plan, send it to a regulator, the regulator works for the people in public interest, and it says you can earn a fair return as long as you keep the lights on and meet this plan for the needs of society. So says all of us. And I think that the answer to your question is pretty simple. PJM has a real problem with getting new capacity in its current system. If you could build on a single warehouse, right, 1.6 megawatts of solar and batteries, that would rate down, one more acronym here, ELCC rating, right, the electric load carrying capacity. That's the amount that PJM agrees is coming back to the grid. So 1.6 megawatts would rate down to 1 megawatt of new capacity in PJM. If you went to 800 warehouses and said, would you allow us to pay you to put this equipment here every month for the next 20 years? You'd have 800 megawatts of new PJM capacity. That's the same size as the largest nuclear power plant in PJM, right? 3 Mile Island, which just got turned on by Constellation to sell to Microsoft to support data center load. So if Microsoft can buy power from 3 Mile Island, right? They're not building their data centers right next to that nuclear facility. That's the beauty of PJM, is that it can send that power anywhere. So by nature of being able to send power anywhere, it means you can generate the power anywhere too. So you could put a single warehouse, 1.6 megawatts, rate it down to 1, and if you could do 800 warehouses a year, you'd have a new 3 Mile Island that you could build every 9 to 12 months. So if you can show me a solution that could build a new, like enterprise scale nuclear power plant every 9 to 12 months in the United States, I'd love to see it. I couldn't hear you say. I have plenty more to say, but we can talk after probably. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Andy Humler, School of Engineering and Applied Science. Very exciting talk. Two concepts in my mind that I'm struggling to put together. I think I have, after a year of study, I think I've figured out DCP and virtual power plants and DERs and the like.
Yeah.
And then time of use rates, which we've been thinking about for a long time. I guess my question is, would time of use rates help the implementation of DERs? Is it necessary? What's the connection between those two?
That's a great question. So time of use rates would help the implementation of people wanting to buy DERs. So if you think about, so Paul asked me the question, is this BTM or FTM, right? I think these are best described as front of the meter contractually because they do not impact the bill. You just got a check to host a thing. So this is just like have a physical thing. Time of use rates are a really important tool to encourage anyone who has the time, money, and interest in building their own DER to benefit fairly from their contribution to the grid. So when a solar is generated and a battery is stored, and then you dispatch it onto the grid, you should have the ability to buy energy from the grid when it's cheapest and send it back when it's most expensive and be fairly compensated for your participation in the grid, right? And lots of concepts like being a good energy citizen or whatever. This can be true for one homeowner, it can be true for a big company, but time of use rates really are about encouraging the adoption of DERs. But here's the thing, even in the markets where there have been the highest levels of DER adoption, like California, you're still talking about a relatively small portion of the grid. It is still hard and slow because there just aren't that many people out there who wake up on a Tuesday, I call this the Tuesday test, who wake up on a Tuesday and say, you know what I'm gonna do today? I'm gonna buy a battery to participate in the inertial balancing of the US electric grid. That is a strange person. Some of them may be in this room, but you're strange. So that time of use is a good incentive to encourage what might be, maybe ambiently 2% of people would do that. If you do time of use rates right, that might rise to 5% of people. And that's good, and I'm for that. I think we should do that. I just don't think it's the same scale and proactive power of a utility saying, well, the grid needs 5 gigawatts of this stuff, so let's just go do it. Get this fellow here and one
We
in the
have time
back.
for Oscar, 1 or 2 more questions.
We'll go in the back there and then here. Okay. You
Can I go
first.
first?
Yeah, you first, sorry.
Hi, I'm Andreas Sakalaris, Telcus Energy. I run an advisory firm. In fact, I've worked with your team on your proposal for Diageo. They're my client.
Yeah, oh, great. Nice.
So we can chat about that later. But so a lot of our clients are industrial firms, pretty much what you described, but much larger interconnections and loads in the tens of megawatts normally, or even hundreds of megawatts. And what we've struggled with a lot in our projects is that the business case is very clear for the BTM part. So either BTM solar if there's a lot of land, if there's less land, BTM behind the meter battery to reduce the bill, right? But whenever we've tried to go the next step and have a larger project that can do in front of the meter exactly what you described, which I love the idea, it's just then you get up against interconnection applications and timelines. And so essentially, like, what have you found that works to allow a site, a small industrial load, say, become a front of the meter asset and not have an endless interconnection process?
Yeah. So when you're working with your clients and you're helping them determine whether they're doing behind the meter or front of the meter, right? Part of that whole conversation is the CFO of that business has decided to allocate some resources to on-site energy, right? So they're determining, do I spend 50 million this way or 50 million this way? Show me some options, right? So inherent in that is the need for a customer or a corporation to be making a capital decision about how to best profit from owning and operating energy equipment, BTM or FTM. What's exciting about this idea is it'll be FTM, but the utility will have planned it, owned it, and operated it because the utility's core business is operating and maintaining a grid. And so the corporation does not need to make a capital decision to buy and own assets because the utility will show up, knock on the door, and say, I will put a system that I have designed and approved as a utility, by the way, skipping the interconnect queue in a lot of cases because the utility has already decided that that's the part of the grid that needs the darn equipment. The interconnect queue, for those who don't know, is when a customer knocks on a utility's door and says, I would like to build a solar and battery system here, please. And it is very large and it will feed back into your grid. The utility, I think pretty understandably, says, okay, I got to spend a bunch of time thinking about that because I didn't expect you as a whiskey distillery to put this much solar here, right? I thought you were making whiskey, not electrons. And the whiskey person says, nope, we're electrons now, also whiskey. And the utility has to think about how that impacts the grid. If the utility if you reverse the flow and the utility comes to that whiskey distillery and says, you happen to be in a part of the grid that's constrained, there's going to be a data center down the road from you. We would love to put solar and batteries here because we know the grid needs it, and that's been part of our 3-year planning process. Then you skip the interconnect queue completely. So kind of two answers there, but does that track? Yes. That's right. That's right. Utilities have put this stuff gigawatts at a time into central planning. They figured out where at the feeder level the grid needs it, and they're going to knock on the door of a corporation and say, can we put this on their site? And then that corporation can hire you to make sure that that site and the technical stuff is still working on their site.
Okay, I think that's it for
Maybe
questions.
one
Or
back
one
there?
more?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
yes.
Got to get the student ones.
Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Jia, and I'm in the Master of Environmental Studies program. I have a question about this ownership of the DER assets. Which business model do you see as more successful? Is this the one that utilities own these DER assets, or is like the opt-in, opt-out VPP programs that consumers own these assets? If it's like the utility one, which is more successful, is it because that the utilities want a higher rate of return from these CapEx, or is it like they don't want to lose the sales from these BDM DER assets, or is it like they want to have more control or operation of these DERs for grid planning or participation in the energy markets as a DER aggregation?
Great. It's a good question. There's a lot in there. So try to cover it quickly. We're short on time. So I think that the answer is that both will exist. So nothing about a distributed capacity procurement prevents a customer from deciding to buy their own distributed energy. You said something there about customer participation in VPPs. So most of those are like signing up your thermostat, your water heater, if you have an EV charger, right? All that is great. It's good for the grid. We should do as much connected asset customer-led VPPs as possible. Because what's great about that is a private individual has purchased a thermostat and participates with grid value and gets paid something for it. So that's efficient for the system because a private citizen has chosen to purchase that equipment for their own purposes. But I would draw a distinction. People don't buy things because they have a low cost of capital and the utility wants a high cost of capital. People buy things because they need thermostats, cars, and water heaters, right? That's showers, hot air, and driving. And so anywhere we can overlap the money people spend for their normal lives with supporting the demand flexibility of the grid, we should do as much of as we can and support all those models of VPP growth. But there aren't going to be enough of those. The amount of load you can get from thermostats can be more than people might think, but still not 100 gigawatts, right, to help double the grid. And so the distributed capacity procurement sort of sits on top of the VPPs and is a proactive installation of new assets that no one person would have bought, or even the whiskey distillery wouldn't have necessarily bought on their own with their own dollars. Because the grid needs it, but no one person doesn't need it, right? If you think about the last question, a lot of these big corporate customers are struggling, saying, look, I want to be part of this stuff, but like, I can't make money on the BTM or the FTM, or maybe I need the system to be too small. The utility wants the system to exist so that it can help society build new manufacturing and data centers. So the utility has a very different reason for doing it. One quick point on utility cost of capital. There is a lot of confusion and a lot of ink has been spilled by advocates saying that utilities have a really high cost of capital, which is, I think, kind of funny because the reason we gave them a monopoly was that they could accept a really low cost of capital, but it was guaranteed. So if you think about the return that utilities offer their shareholders, it's the dividend that a shareholder gets when they invest in the utility, and those are on average 3.4%, as high as 5, as low as 2. So if I told you to go to Wall Street and start a business and say, I want $100 billion to build a landscape scale machine exposed for the weather to public purpose, and I can't say no to anyone who wants to use my machine, and if there's a storm, it breaks, and I'm going to give you, Wall Street, 3.4% for that $100 billion, do you know what Blackstone or someone would say, right? They want a 14 or 18% return to give you a private capital to go build that sort of machine and take that sort of risk. So the reason that a monopoly, a public purpose regulated monopoly exists is precisely to lower the cost of capital, but not rely on taxpayer dollars. So I would posit, we can end on this, I would posit that the US electric system has done the impossible, which is take private money from Wall Street, no taxpayer dollars, right? Because if you use a taxpayer dollar, you've got to compete with a school, you got to compete with a road, you got to compete with a hospital. So no taxpayer money, it's Wall Street's money. They have a darn near guaranteed 3.4% return, which is low, boring, but predictable. So that's good for pension funds, good for insurance funds. So we took Wall Street's money and we built a landscape scale machine exposed to weather that you only pay for when you turn the light switch on, and that is the foundation of our entire economy. And the state of Pennsylvania pays about 4% of all the dollars in this state for electric power. And the other 96, the whole economy, are almost totally dependent on that electric power. So to me, that's one of the most successful balances of private capital and public purpose regulation in history. And I think that's really the thing that people sometimes miss about the US electric model.
Pierre, thanks for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for being here and for your engagement and thoughtful questions. A recording of this event will be available on the Kleinman Center website next week. As you leave the room, make sure you grab box lunch just outside the doors. You're welcome to bring that in here for a bit and enjoy that. So thanks again for everybody for being here.